So let us look at our life as a game for children, wherein nothing is serious but honesty, a good heart, and respectability, duty towards oneself. Immanuel Kant. In my last two lectures, I talked about what Kant has to say about the good, the happy life. And I discussed various specific aspects of that, but it really comes down to not so much being a positive doctrine of what you need to do to attain happiness, and more a negative doctrine of what you need to avoid. Namely, it comes down to independence. You should be independent, for one, of your own psyche, namely your affections and your passions, that is, feelings or desires that grow so strong that they overtake you, that they make you unable to consider your other feelings or desires, that they make you unable to properly use your own reason. And also, you should become independent of your inclinations. You should need as little as possible. You should thereby become independent of the objects of the world. If you need all kinds of objects, all kind of possessions, all kind of luxury to be happy, then that is a sure way to become unhappy, while he who needs less will also have less reason to be unhappy. And therefore, Kant's doctrine of happiness is, I already said that it's very much influenced by the ancient philosophies of the Stoics, of the Epicureans. Kant's doctrine of happiness is largely a doctrine of independence. Who, after all, Kant says, would want to put himself into chains when he could rather be free. But after having discussed specific aspects, the passions and affections, Kant's Stoicism, Kant's Epicureanism, I now want to talk a bit more generally about what Kant has to say about happiness. And to him, the key to the happy life is not taking seriously what shouldn't be taken seriously. Kant is saying that happiness or unhappiness is not so much about physical pleasure or pain, rather it is about how we deal with that. And so Kant says, sure, you might have physical pain, you might hurt yourself, you might get sick or whatever, but you should not let that physical pain sadden you. For one, you should not let that happen because it would mean you're a wimpy weakling, and it is simply not in line with your dignity as a human being, as a rational, autonomous being. But also, you should not let your pain, your suffering sadden you, because it is foolish. It is foolish if you cannot change this pain. Now, of course, if it's something you can change, then the most rational thing is to go and change it, right? So if you are sick and there's some medicine, better take the medicine. But assuming you are dealing with something that cannot be changed, for example, you have some sickness that cannot be cured or whatever, or for example, you lost a loved one that cannot be brought back from the dead. If you have some pain and it cannot directly be cured, then Kant would say it is foolish to dwell on that pain. The pain is already there. You're only making it worse if you feel bad about being in pain. So rather try not to dwell on it. Indeed, Kant says the only thing we should ever feel bad about is our misdeeds. So our moral actions. First, because that's the only thing that matters. But second, also because that's the only thing that's completely in our hand, right? Everything else, and here you can see how Kant is, of course, influenced by the Stoics. Everything else, everything belonging to the physical world, even everything concerning our own body, is not fully in our own hands. Our morality is. Here you can go back to my lecture on the goodwill. The whole point in Kant's moral philosophy is that being moral is only about the goodwill. It's not about being successful necessarily. Of course, that again is not fully in your hands. So if you see someone drowning and you're jumping into the water and swimming over to pull him out, but you're not there in time, then again, you should not regret this. You should not reproach yourself. You should not beat yourself up over not having saved that person. That again would be foolish, because it was apparently not in your power. You already did all that you could do. You swam there as fast as you could. So it's not your fault that you weren't there in time. No, the only thing that matters for morality is the goodwill. Of course, as I explained in the lecture on goodwill, Kant is talking about more than merely wishing well to everyone. He does say that a truly good will will also try to realize itself through actions. But still, for being a good person or not, it's not relevant whether your action succeeded. It's just relevant that you wanted it to succeed and that you did what you could. And so, therefore, once we realize that morality is not about the success of our good deeds, it's just about trying to do good deeds, then we realize that our morality is completely in our hand, because it's about our goodwill, it's about our attitude. And therefore, if we are not moral, if we lack the goodwill, that is completely our own fault. And so therefore, this is the only thing we should ever feel bad about, Kant says. Now, even here, Kant stresses that you should not just feel bad about it. Feeling bad about your misdeeds only has value if it leads to you acting better, right? I mean, regret as such is worthless. It just doubles the pain in the world, assuming you have hurt somebody else and now you're hurting yourself because of that. You're feeling bad about what you have done to somebody else. The other person's not gonna feel better because of that. And also, Kant is aware that there can be, this is something, of course, that Nietzsche has worked a lot on afterwards. Kant is aware that there can be a great self-righteousness in feeling regret, beating yourself up, whipping yourself for your sins, because by saying, oh, I'm such a terrible sinner, in a way you are saying, oh, I'm so great, right? Because the truly terrible sinner would not feel bad about it. He would just keep sinning. If you feel bad about it, if you beat yourself up, if you sacrifice your happiness, then you must be such a great person. No, Kant is against such self-righteousness. He says regret as such has no value. It only has value if it leads you to doing better in the future. This is also the reason that Kant repeatedly advises for priests, and this is not random advice, right? You have to realize that lots of Kant's students, as a university professor, were gonna be future priests. So Kant has a direct reason to stress this, to tell them this, because the system back then at university was that there were these three higher faculties of jurisprudence, of medicine, and of theology. And there was the lower faculty of philosophy, and everyone would first go through philosophy, do their magister, so their master's degree, and then probably go on to study one of the other three subjects and become a doctor there. So the theologians, the future theologians that studied in Königsberg, where Kant taught, would probably go through his lectures. And back then in the 18th century, it was, of course, still normal that if a person was about to die, you would call a priest to their bed. And the priest would probably ask the person to confess one last time. The priest would probably ask the person to think about his sins and to regret his sins. And some people would really, because they would think that they were about to die and probably go to hell, would really become very regretful. And some people that had spent all their lives sinning and doing harm to others would swear to change, to become better. And Kant often points out that this regret in the face of death and of possible eternal torment is not worth so much, and that there have been lots of people that were also regretful when they got terribly sick, but then some people that actually didn't die and got better again, they again forgot all their regrets and resumed their sinful lives. So Kant is telling the priests, don't tell the people on their deathbed to just regret and just utter words of remorse. Rather tell them to actually compensate their bad deeds with good deeds as much as is still possible, right? Of course, maybe some misdeeds you did, you cannot properly compensate. Like if you killed someone, even if you regret it now, you cannot bring him back. But maybe some things can still be changed. Like if you robbed someone, or if you committed fraud, tricked someone for their money, maybe on your deathbed you can still give money back to that person, or still put that person in your last will so that he will get the money back. And Kant is recommending such things. He's saying, if you regret a bad deed, that only has worth insofar as that regret is not an empty feeling, and certainly not a self-righteous thing, but insofar as it actually makes you a better person for the future, that is, insofar as it makes you act better. And the first thing you should do is, if you can make it up somehow, if you can offer any sorts of reparations or whatever, then that is what you should do. But anyways, again, Kant is saying in life, concerning happiness, there is no point beating yourself up over things that cannot be changed. There is no point being sad over things that are not within your power. You should only focus on that which is within your power, on your morality. The wise man, Kant says, will only take the moral law seriously, will only take seriously his own moral duties, and everything else in life, including the hardships, the misfortunes of life, he will take with a certain cheerfulness if he can. You just have to consider, Kant would say, that the only thing of true worth is your moral actions. And if you consider the worth of life by what we can feel, feeling pleasure, feeling pain, having good, having bad feelings, then overall Kant says life is not worth all that much. I mean, even if you live an all in all happy life, even if you are spared greater misfortunes and hardships, still life is of course not filled with constant pleasures, right? Even the happiest life contains pain. I mean, you get sick sometimes, you step your toe or whatever. And even if we are not talking about direct pain, there's just so much time in life that is boring or sort of empty, where, I don't know, you're doing your taxes, or you're just walking or driving from A to B, and you might not be in great pain. But if you just consider this moment and ask yourself, is this life really worth living? It's probably not worth that much. So Kant says, if we judge the value of life only by what we can feel in life, and only by what we can get out of life, what we can indulge in life, then it's not worth that much. Life has lots of worth if we judge its value by what we can do in life, the moral actions we can do. Kant judges life's worth not by what we can indulge in, but by what we can do. And again, to him, this outlook of the wise person, of the sage, is the key to happiness. You should just consider, Kant says, that everything in life is kind of fleeting. I mean, life itself will be past soon enough. So there is no reason to be overly happy at your fortune or to be overly unhappy at your misfortune. Because again, it's all fleeting. The only thing that is constant, according to Kant, is the consciousness of your own righteousness if you're a good person. That is the one thing. If you're truly good, then you know that your goodwill is permanent. That not only do you have goodwill now, but you will keep having the goodwill. And so, since this is the only thing of permanence, the only constant thing, it is also rationally the only thing we should care about. If you only care about your own virtue, then the value of your life depends on something that is completely in your own hands. If you give value, if you give importance to anything else but your virtue, including your physical pleasure and pain, then you foolishly, irrationally make the value of your life depend on something that is not completely in your own hands. So Kant is very much aware, and he points out that the less people are worth by their character, by their morality, the less worth their life has, the more they tend to ascribe worth to life. While the people who are worth the most, the best, the most noble people, are at the same time those people, despite their life having the highest worth, that ascribe the least worth to life. Right? I mean, a good person is worth millions of the bad people. But he will say, my life is worth nothing, right? Consider someone like Greta Thunberg, who says, sure, I might be in some danger, when I go on the Sumut flotilla and try to reach Gaza. Um, they could abduct me, they could harm me, they could torture me, they could imprison me. But really, they can do nothing to me that is worse than what they are doing to the people in Gaza, and I'm not worth any more than the people in Gaza. So why should I run away from that possibility, right? Um, while on the other hand, the bad people, the selfish people, they will want to save their own skin, or not even just their skin, their life, also their comfort. They want to stay alive, but the question is, what for? Their life is not worth anything, right? From a moral standpoint, from the standpoint of reason. If we ask, not subjectively, for this person, of course, this person, he himself, he wants to be alive, he wants to feel good. But objectively, from the perspective of reason, I could ask, about a bad person that does not contribute anything to the world, that does not make the world a better place. Why? What for is he even alive? What would be lost if he wasn't alive, right? And exactly those people, where nothing would be lost if they didn't exist, cling to existence the most. Kant even goes so far as to say, even an evil person, even a villain, who in death, in dying, shows a certain sublime heroism, shows that he can, in a way, throw himself away, shows a certain self-denial, thereby shows that he at least had the disposition to maybe become a good and noble person, right? Because at least he had the disposition of someone who could live for something higher than his own personal selfish good. And of course, here you can think of certain people that might be condemned in our world as maybe terrorists and villains and whatever. Now, I'm not one of those leftists that have no regard for humanity, for human dignity, that are so occupied by their ideology, let's say their anti-imperialist ideology, that I would excuse any crime against humanity just because it is committed in the name of the fight for freedom or for justice. No. If you fight for justice, you should probably do it in a just way. So I'm not one to excuse any crime, even if there was a maybe good reason to commit it, or even if it was committed in the fight against the bad guys. I mean, if you start excusing something like, for example, the crimes that were committed on the 7th of October, I'm of course not talking about made up crimes like 40 beheaded babies, but the real crimes that were, of course, committed, like throwing grenades in bunkers with scared civilians or whatever. If you start excusing that because again, it was in the fight against the bad guys, because it was in the name of a just cause, then you might as well excuse allied war crimes. Then you might as well excuse the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Japan, because it was also committed against the bad guys. It was also in the name of a good fight. No, I'm not one to excuse such actions, but still, I am even more disgusted than I am by the leftists who turn certain criminals into heroes and martyrs. Even more disgusted I am by the common aufklärt, liberal, centrist, all these good humanists that our journalists are, for example, who would condemn such people, who would call such people terrorists and extremists and monsters and so on, from their comfy lives, when they, these ausgeklärt humanists, would never fight for anything, not even the best of causes, when they would never sacrifice their comfort. I mean, we all know this to be the case. We all know when fascism rises to power, these people, even though they profess to be against fascism, are nowhere to be seen. These people will not be hunted down and put into camps by the fascists, because these people will fall into lockstep. So, to me, these people are far worse than, let's say, some Hamas terrorist or so. And I certainly have much more respect for someone like Sinwar or Che Guevara or whatever than the common Western journalists, because again, not excusing specific crimes, but there are people, as Kant says, that demonstrate at least a certain heroism, a certain self-denial that could have been used for something good. So you could imagine with this disposition that had such a person lived in a different world, in different times, had such a person been raised differently, had such a person maybe not grown up in a people that was oppressed and enslaved, had such a person been allowed to develop his moral dispositions, maybe he could have been a much better person and contributed much more to the world than those who now criticize and condemn such persons. But be that as it may, Kant says the actual keys to happiness, or the actual, as he puts it, weapons in fighting the unhappiness, fighting the misfortune, are reason, virtue, righteousness. Neither living long nor living well with lots of pleasure and little pain is all that important when it comes down to it. Kant says, for example, we have to die anyways one day. Once that happens, once we die, what good will it have done us that we ate lavishly or that we drove around in carriages? He recommends to often consider how short, how brief, how fleeting life is. That can help us both with our morality and with our happiness. It can help with our morality because if you think about it, people are not moral, people are evil because they take life, or the pleasures, the comforts of life, too seriously, right? You might steal because you take your own possessions, your own wealth too seriously. You might rape because you take your own pleasure too seriously. If you just accept that even if you did gain something that you might gain through a crime, you will soon enough lose it again. Life is short anyway. Then you might not do these crimes. Likewise, considering how short life is might make you more brave. I mean, Let's say you live in some sort of despotic, tyrannical system, some sort of dictatorship, and you don't dare standing up, you don't dare contribute to a revolution, or you don't dare helping people. Like you live in a Nazi time, and you don't dare hiding a Jew that is trying to escape. Why? Because you take life too seriously. And here Kant reminds us, we cannot lose our life. It's not possible, because you can only lose what you possess. And you don't possess your life. You will lose your life anyways. So all that you can lose, Kant says, is a certain time of your life. You can lose some years of your life. Let's say you are 40 maybe. Okay, maybe you have another 40 or 50 years to live. Now, if you stand up against an oppressive regime and they execute you for it, again, they didn't take your life. You would have died anyway. They just took another 40 or 50 years from your life. And all things considered, what is that really? I mean, this universe has existed for billions of years before you. It will exist for billions of years after you. You're just a tiny little bug on a tiny little speck of dirt that is drifting through space. In the grand scheme of things, what does it matter if you lived 40, 50 years longer or shorter? But not only will this kind of attitude help your morality, as I say, it will also help your happiness. Because if you consider everything to be fleeting, then you will not give so much importance to things. And then even your misfortunes will not hit so hard. I mean, even if something bad happens, even if you suddenly lose a loved one, I'm not saying that's nice, but again, you can just consider that this person would have died anyways, and that you will die anyways also. So really all that was lost was some years, which again, in the grand scheme of things, is not such a big deal, really. So by this attitude, you sort of free yourself from this life and from fortune and misfortune. And Kant points out that you cannot even say that a longer life is necessarily a better life, right? But if you grow old, but then you just lose your mental capacities, or your body grows frail, you cannot walk anymore, and you are basically just vegetating in your bed, needing the care of the nurses. Or he also says there's this nice little pre-critical essay of Kant's, a sort of letter he wrote to the mother of one of his students who had suddenly died as a young man, where Kant tries to console her. And he also says, okay, we are used to saying, oh, this poor guy, his life was only just starting, or he was in the middle of his best years, and now death took him away. But we don't know if his life was really just starting. We don't know what would have happened in a year or 2 or 10. We don't know if something terrible would have happened to him. We don't know if he had fallen under bad influences and fallen into sin, and maybe it was a blessing that he was taken away now, when he had his best time, before worse times could start for him, right? We don't know that. And Kant even says, if we judge the value of life by how much we can indulge, how much pleasure or pain there is, not only is the worth of life not much, it is less than nothing. It is less than zero. Because Kant believes that all in all, the pain that we experience in life does outweigh the pleasure. Now, he seems to not always be of that opinion. Um, at least if you read the earlier, the pre-critical Kant, you will also find him at one point disagreeing with another thinker who says exactly that. But for the most part, Kant and the older Kant does say that the pain outweighs the pleasure. Maybe this is something that he came to believe more in his older life, maybe because he himself, I addressed this in the lecture on Kant's life, he himself started to have more physical problems, started to have issues with his digestion, started to not be able to eat certain foods anymore, started to most of all have mental problems, to find himself not able to work on his works anymore. Getting to a point where he said his vegetative functions were still working. He was not feeling direct pains, but his intellectual capacity was largely gone. But be that as it may, all in all, Kant does say that pain outweighs the pleasure in life. Even if you have a good life without great hardships or misfortunes, there will be a lot of moments that are not all that pleasurable. It doesn't even have to be great pain that you go through. I mean, it's enough that it's boring, right? Maybe you will not be outright miserable, but there will be times when you have to do your taxes, or times when you're walking or driving just from A to B, and in that moment, being alive is probably not worth all that much, right? And sure, then there may be other moments where you're enjoying good food or good sex or good company or whatever, but those are just moments, and then you go back to maybe not a painful but maybe a neutral state. And so all in all, again, life from that perspective is not worth all that much. Which is exactly why Kant says that death and the prospect of death is terrible to our sensuality. As sensual beings, like all animals, we have this drive for survival, for wanting to stay alive. But to our reason, if we manage to abstract from this sensual instinct of ours and just abstractly and objectively think about it, all things considered, to our reason, death is not only not terrible, but even welcome. It would be a terrible prospect to our reason if we were mortal. I find this interesting, these remarks of Kant, in particular when you compare them to the considerations of other thinkers, and when you look at where they agreed and where they disagreed. I find this to be generally, not just when it comes to Kant, when you study philosophy, I find this to be a very useful exercise, you could say. Most people, the people who think unphilosophically, will treat everything as an opinion. And so when they deal with the history of philosophy, they will be like, okay, this philosopher had that opinion and this philosopher had another opinion. And then maybe they will choose which opinion aligns most with their own, which they happen to agree with. But you cannot just randomly have opinions. If if you reflect only even just a little, then certain thoughts become necessary, right? You cannot say that Socrates is immortal if you believe that all humans are mortal and that Socrates was a human being. You have to now necessarily agree that he too is mortal. As I explained in my lecture on what is reason, to Kant, reason is the faculty of principles. You have a principle and you deduce from that principle specifics, particular opinions, particular points. And so, therefore, there's only so many, let's say, opinions that you can have. And at least if you're consistent in your thinking, it depends on your principles, on your premises. Assume a certain premise and you will arrive at a certain conclusion. And if someone else arrives at a different conclusion, then at some point he must have assumed a different principle, a different premise in the first place. And so such comparisons can be helpful. So if you compare Kant with Schopenhauer, Schopenhauer is of course known to be the great pessimist, known for being someone who said life all in all is miserable, it would have been better if we didn't exist, this is the worst possible world. And if you read Kant only superficially, if you don't study Kant more extensively, you might simply think that, okay, Kant disagrees, Kant has another opinion. But actually, here it turns out, if you read more closely, that Kant judges life quite similar to Schopenhauer. He also has a somewhat pessimistic outlook on life, saying there's more pain than pleasure. Being alive is not worth that much. If we consider from the standpoint of reason, we are actually relieved that there's death. So what is the difference then? Well, the difference is morality. To Kant, it is true that from the physical standpoint, from the standpoint of our feeling, pain outweighs the pleasure, and therefore life is not worth much. But to Kant, it is also true that this standpoint simply does not matter much. The standpoint of reason, and therefore of morality, matters more. This life has value because we can do moral actions here, because we have a moral duty here. We have been put here to fulfill a certain task, so to say. And whether we enjoy this life or not, simply does not factor in that much. That's also largely a reason why suicide is morally forbidden. It would mean running away from your moral obligations, right? Now, if you had no obligations, if life was morally irrelevant and it was only about your subjective pleasure, then maybe to Kant, suicide would actually become somewhat rational, but that is simply not the case. Well, and if you turn to Schopenhauer, I mean, Schopenhauer is an a-rationalist. He did not believe that reason was a thing. He fundamentally believed in a completely random, completely irrational first principle, his will, which should rather be called the drive. And therefore, to Schopenhauer, there's also no morality. Now, lots of people don't quite get that because they simply don't know what morality is. They will be fooled by Schopenhauer talking about morality. But really, all his so-called morality is not about duty. It's not about us having a task here, about us really contributing to the world. Rather, it's just a feeling-based pseudo-morality of compassion. basically life sucks for you, and you understand that other beings are just like you, life sucks for them also, and so you take pity on them and try to not make it even worse for them. That's all there is to it. So there's no real morality in the sense of us having a moral duty, in the sense of um, our life having a sense, having a meaning. And then it makes perfect sense to be a pessimist. Now, let's go one step further. Let's think of Nietzsche, who was influenced by Schopenhauer, but ultimately rejected this pessimism, this rejection of life, and tried to create a philosophy that affirms life, that says yes to life, that embraces life, with everything that belongs to it, right? Nietzsche was under no illusions here. Life does include pain and hardship and suffering, and it does include that by necessity. You cannot take that out of life, Nietzsche would say. And yet, still, he wanted a philosophy that embraces life with these necessary hardships and sufferings that belong to it. And here, again, it turns out that Nietzsche moves closer back to Kant. Lots of people might again overlook that because they don't think in principles. They just look at the surface, where it seems that Nietzsche is very different from Kant and disagrees with Kant quite a lot. But if you think about it, Nietzsche says what gives meaning to life and what gives you a reason, despite the pain, the suffering that is included in life, to be alive, and to say it is better that we are alive rather than not being alive, is that you live not for yourself and your selfish gain. Because again, here all three, Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, agree that you cannot gain all that much in life for yourself. You gain more pain than you gain pleasure, but rather that you live for something higher than yourself, that you live for an ideal. And Nietzsche is even in agreement with Kant that this ideal is not something that is given to us from the outside. Let's say from God, who just tells us you have to do this or that, but rather that it is something we give ourselves. So there is, in Kant's terminology, there is no heteronomy, there's autonomy. Now, of course, unlike Kant, Nietzsche would not say that this ideal comes from reason specifically. He would also not talk about us having a duty to follow and realize this ideal. And he would not put it into moral terms. But really, at the end of the day, if you think things through, if you want to affirm life, if you do not want to be a pessimist like Schopenhauer who rejects life, then you do need to be a rationalist. You do need a meaning that does not come out of the sensual, but of the intellectual, of reason. And you do, in the end up with morality. So Kant's position is really the only consistent one if you don't want to be a pessimist. And anyone who is an a-rationalist, who rejects reason and thereby morality, and yet still does not come to the conclusion that life is worthless and meaningless and sucks, is simply superficial. And again, it was important for me to point this out and to draw this comparison with other thinkers, precisely to show that, again, in philosophy, you're not just confronted with random opinions, but rather when two thinkers deviate, assuming they are consistent in their thinking and drawing the right conclusion, then at some point there must be a difference in principles, and you should always not remain at the surface and just compare opinions and which one you like better, but you should always go back to the principles. You should always ask, okay, what premise makes this thinker arrive at this conclusion? And in this case, the premise is either being a rationalist and thereby a moralist, or being an irrationalist and thereby having no morality. The fact that mere life is not worth all that much, and that to our reason it is actually a relief that life is short, to Kant is illustrated by a simple fact. That is, he claims that no rational person would want to repeat life. Only an irrational, a thoughtless person would want to do that. So if you could offer a rational person at the end of his life to choose what his future would be, if he would rather go into nothing or maybe go on to some eternal life, or if he would want to repeat life on earth, Kant says no rational person would want to repeat life on earth. Even if you lived an overall happy life, you would not want to repeat the very same life. And even if you could lead another life with better conditions, like for example, this time be born into a wealthy family or whatever, even then Kant says you would not want to repeat life. Again, sure, your life might overall be fine. You might not be plagued by having a terrible illness, or by losing your loved ones in an accident, or by suffering through a war or whatever, or by poverty. But even then, consider not necessarily the pain, the suffering, but consider the boredom of life, or consider just how much life could drag. Like if I have to imagine going through 12 years of school again, and I had a generally overall happy school life, like I didn't hate going to school, but still having to learn writing again, having to get all my education again, having to reread everything I read again from start, having to meet people again, all of that, Kant says no one would want to repeat if they are rational. So of course I will point out that here Kant is very much in conflict with Nietzsche, because Nietzsche, of course, later had this idea of the eternal return of the same. And to him, precisely that idea is the highest possible affirmation of life. To Nietzsche, we should live our life in such a manner that we can want for this life, for this exact life, with the exact same choices, the exact same happenings, every single second of our life to repeat eternally. So here we see a great difference between these two thinkers. For Nietzsche, this is the most sublime, the greatest thought, at least to the person strong enough to bear it, the Übermensch, the superhuman. To Kant, this is something that our reason would reject. And to him, the fact that our reason would reject it shows that life is not all that great. But anyways, everything I've said so far leads me to what to Kant is the true key to a good life. He says, be master of yourself, replace bad or annoying thoughts with good thoughts, and assume the attitude of practical idealism. That is what protects us from all misfortune, and that is what makes us permanently content with life. And what it means to Kant, this practical idealism, is that we take nothing seriously that is merely an item. So nothing irrational, nothing unfree. Only persons, only free, autonomous, rational beings ought to be taken seriously. And the practical idealism means that we don't take this world too seriously, and we realize that our happiness and the way this world appears to us largely depend on ourselves, on our fantasy or imagination, Kant says at some point. I, in my own terminology, would say on our posture. You should consider what idealism means in Kant's terminology. And I've given a full lecture on transcendental idealism where I explain this further. In general, by idealism, Kant means the philosophical position opposed to realism. Realism says the world is real, so there is a world outside of us, it really exists. And idealism says, no, this whole world is not real. It is just ideal, meaning it's just in our thoughts, it's just an illusion, it's just a dream or whatever. And when it comes to the theoretical, then Kant rejects idealism. At least if by idealism we understand empirical idealism. Kant is a transcendental idealist, but he is an empirical realist. Again, what that means you can learn in my lecture on transcendental idealism. That's too complicated to put into one sentence here, and for this lecture it also doesn't matter. For this lecture, when we are saying idealism in the theoretical sense, we can stick to what Kant calls empirical idealism. So the empirical world, that world which you experience, the things as they appear to you, concerning this world, Kant is a realist, an empirical realist. He says, yes, this world is not just a dream, it does indeed exist. It exists only as appearance. The world that appears to us is just that, the appearance. It's not a thing in itself. That's why Kant is a transcendental idealist. But the empirical idealism that says that even as appearances, these things that appear to us are not real, they're just dreams. This empirical idealism Kant rejects. Not only rejects, he disproves it. Again, I discussed this in the lecture on transcendental idealism, and I also came back to it and discussed it in my lecture on rational psychology. But this is all just true for theoretical philosophy. In practical philosophy, Kant embraces idealism. Now, practical always means it has to do with acting. So what Kant is saying, don't believe that the world around you is not real, that it's just an illusion, that it's just a dream. Theoretically, this is wrong. But act as if you believed it. Act as if you considered this world just a dream. That is the practical idealism. So don't take this world too seriously, and don't consider yourself dependent on that world. In my own philosophical language, I would stress that the human being is not a victim, again, not dependent on the world, but rather that the human being is a perpetrator, someone active. The world is dependent on us. And Kant says the practical idealism is about understanding that largely, whether we are sad or happy, does not depend on the world, as if there is an objective world outside of us that does things to us, right? Things are happening to us, and this determines how we feel, but rather our happiness or our sadness largely depends on us. It largely depends on how we approach the world, on what we make out of the world. And again, this attitude, this is what Kant calls the practical idealism. It's not a theoretical statement on the real, let's say, ontological status of the world. It is a practical attitude of how we deal with the world. If you take life to be something heavy, then you turn it into something heavy for yourself, Kant says. In the history of philosophy, there are two opposing models. Going back to the ancient pre-Socratic philosophers, Democritus, he is actually not truly pre-Socratic. If you consider the time frame, he's more of the same time as Plato, and Heraclitus. And of these two, it is related that Heraclitus is called the sad philosopher, the melancholic philosopher, because he took this world with all its misery, with all the vices and evil in the world, very seriously, and he was sad at the state of the world. While Democritus is called the laughing philosopher. Of him, it is said that he was in a good and a cheerful mood because he treated the world with a certain irony, and because he did not look at humans' actions so much as evil and vicious, but more as follies that were laughable. And looking at these two models, Kant is on the side of Democritus. He says this is the attitude we should have, not being melancholy and depressed at the state of the world, rather taking it with irony. He says that nothing in life, again, always exempting our moral duty, nothing should be taken seriously. Rather, life should be taken as a ridiculous affair, really, and as a sort of game for children that, okay, we take part in because we've been thrust into it, but we don't take it too seriously. And with this attitude, you neither become too sad about your misfortunes, nor do you become too happy about your fortunes. Because again, both becomes child's play. Kant would say most that people consider misfortune or a reason for misery is really just laughable, it's just ridiculous, does not have to be taken so seriously. And on the other hand, most pleasure, most that people desire or that they consider great fortune, is just a pleasure of delusion. Delusion is always an important concept in Kant's philosophy. I will talk about it more when I get to his concept of aufkläring, of enlightenment, because to him, aufkläring is largely about getting rid of delusions. And indeed, if you think about it, sure, there are certain things in life that are better to have than not to have. Everyone wants a full stomach. You don't want to go hungry. Or sure, you would rather have a roof over your head rather than be homeless. Fair enough. But if you do have a roof over your head, does it have to be a large mansion with over 100 rooms? I mean, do you really, really need over 100 rooms? Or if you do have a full stomach, isn't it enough to enjoy a simple yet still tasteful meal? Does it have the most expensive, most exquisite foods? Do they really taste so much better than the regular food? Or is it just that it seems to be better to us because we have told ourselves, oh, this is so expensive, this is so exquisite, it must be better? Um, so, again, most pleasure is a pleasure of delusion. You might feel bad about not being rich enough to get an expensive car or to get a used phone or to get expensive clothes from certain brands. Um, but really, this is not true pleasure. Um, you don't truly feel better physically in your body um, if you have an expensive car or regular car. Um, it's just all an illusion in your mind. It's just that you are telling yourself that now you're better, now you're cooler, now you have a bigger dick because you have an expensive car. And that's why you think this is a greater pleasure in life. So if you just stop having these delusions, if you just not change the world, meaning you don't change the car you have or the food you eat or whatever, but change your attitude towards the world, um, then that's it. That's enough to already live a happier life. And again, understanding this, realizing this, that is exactly the attitude of practical idealism. Realizing we are not simply dependent on the world, but to a large degree, um, we make of the world whatever we want through our attitude. Kant points out that the biggest issue for people, the greatest reason for displeasure, for pain, and therefore for an unhappy life, is really the small things in life. At least this is true for the people of culture, for the people of civilization. I mean, let's face it, at our state here, how many of us are really suffering because there's a food shortage and we are hungry? Or how many of us are really suffering because there are wars and bombs are falling? Sure, there are areas where this is the case, where people have real problems. Um, but again, in culture and civilization, um, most issues are actually small and even ridiculous issues. It's not for nothing that we have started in recent years to call these first world problems, right? And really, if you just think about what Kant is saying here, you will have to agree with him. I mean, I myself, I could relate hundreds of anecdotes from people around me. I mean, for example, I can think of a teenage girl who basically had everything in life. Coming from a very wealthy family, her grandfather owning a big company, she could buy whatever she wanted. She was also conventionally attractive. Um, Really, there wasn't much reason looking at her from the outside to be unhappy, and yet still she would manage to be unhappy. She would have a friend, and when that friend some days would come to school wearing jeans, and this girl had come to school wearing sweatpants, then she would get angry at her friend. saying, oh, why didn't you text me in the morning that you were gonna wear jeans today? Then I would have also dressed with jeans. Now in my sweatpants, walking besides you with your jeans, I feel like a hobo. I mean, really? This is your problem? This is your reason to be unhappy? This is why your day is ruined? This is a completely self-created problem. I mean, she is angry at her friend, so she's acting like the world, specifically her friend, created this problem. But coming from the perspective of practical idealism, we can say, no, she created that problem herself. It's entirely her own making. And she would simply not have that problem if she would just stop having that problem, right? Um, or I'm thinking back of one time we visited my grandmother, and she was talking about how back in the day her own father, in the evenings after work, he would go to the baker and get something for her mother. And she used specific word in German that you could maybe translate by certain type of bun, certain type of cream bun. And my dad just asked her, wasn't it an eclair? Because in German we have these two words, right? Eclair, the word that comes from French, and this other word, it's Liebesknochen, this other German word. And they mean two very similar baked goods, but not necessarily entirely the same. And my grandma, she got super angry. She was like, no, I was there. You can't devalue my experience. You don't know about it. And she somehow felt like the love of her father for her mother had been taken into question. But of course, my dad had never questioned this really happening. He had just questioned about what type of baked good exactly his grandfather had gotten for his grandmother. And I mean, at most, it could have been a misunderstanding between them, using two different words, maybe even for the same thing. I mean, between normal people, you would just discuss this calmly and try to get rid of the misunderstanding, try to make sure that you're both talking about the same baked good. But my grandmother, she got angry for no reason. Um, or likewise, as a third and final anecdote, um, I spent lots of time in an online forum when I was younger, where people would publish stories they had written. And if you opened a thread where you would publish a story, then the rule was that before the title of the story, you had to write story in brackets so that people would know that this is not a thread for discussion or for wishing someone a happy birthday or whatever, but a thread for posting your story. And some people put a space behind the story tag and only then write the title of the story. And some would do it without space, starting the title, starting the first letter of the title right after the closing bracket. And one day, one moderator decided that it would look nicer if it was uniform, and removed all the spaces so that for all the threads the title started right after the bracket. Well, one of the authors got annoyed with that and complained, and said that he wanted his space back. Now, if you ask me, that already didn't matter all that much, but okay, so be it. He prefers it with the space. What would you do as a normal person if you're the moderator? You would just put the space back in. You would say, sorry that I changed it without asking you first. you're the author, you get it how you want. Would have taken 5 seconds. Instead, the moderator got angry, other users got involved, people started bullying this user, this author, basically trying to bully him out of the forum. I said that's not okay, and that you should treat everyone with regard, even if you don't like their tone, or even if you think that they are overreacting or whatever, you still owe them human regard. That in turn made people angry. And all of this turned into a giant fight that lasted for weeks. People got banned temporarily. Someone wrote me that because of this issue, he had spent the last 3 days crying in his bed, all because of a space, because of a single space between two letters. This is a story that is so utterly ridiculous that you cannot possibly make it up. And of course, it's beyond ridiculous, it's also evil. I mean, you must be an evil person to spend 3 days crying in your bed because someone has been mean to you on the internet because of some space, while elsewhere people are dying from war. I mean, how can you be so self centered? But these 3 anecdotes, again, I could tell 100 more, but you can all think of your own lives, of ridiculous things you have done, or friends or relatives or colleagues have done. And you will realize that Kant is right, that mostly the reason people suffer, again, at least for people, let's say in the first world, of course, there are people with actual problems, but civilized man, Kant would say, the reason he suffers is not because of the world, because his world is so terrible and he has to suffer because of what happens to him, but rather because of how he deals with whatever happens to him, because of how he chooses to approach the world. That's precisely why, when I talked aufkläring in school, amongst the first things I told students is, aufkläring yourself means getting rid of problems, because most of your problems are fake. Most of your problems are self-created and are problems that could vanish in an instant if you just acted more rationally and more dignified. Which also brings me back to something I've already said when I started talking about what Kant has to say about happiness, that for the most part, our moral duty and what is prudent, what makes us happy, are not in contradiction, but rather align. We have a moral duty towards ourselves, Kant says. I discussed that in its own specific lecture. We have to live in a dignified manner. We owe that to our own humanity. And precisely that will usually also lead to more happiness. An undignified life will usually be also a less happy life, because we create all these irrational problems that we did not need to have. And of course, this whole practical idealism of Kant perfectly aligns with the teaching of all religion. I mean, consider the New Testament of the Bible saying that you should die in the flesh to be reborn in spirit. Or consider the Quran saying that there is no greater sin than to work on the field or the tilth of this life rather than on that of the other life. Of course, this has little to do with what people make out of religion, with what people consider their religion. But this, and only this, is what deserves the name of religion. Living as a practical idealist, considering this sensual, this physical world to be nothing more than a game, or at best a test, but not considering it to be important. Not living for this world of the flesh, but living for the other world, for the beyond, for the spiritual world, for God. Only that deserves to be called religion. Now, I mean, I live here in a part of Berlin with lots of Turkish, lots of Arabic people, and when I go to a school and I teach aufkläring there and I talk to the little Mohammedan kids, of course, they have zero religion, but they have a superstition, but they have this ideology. They were told that they have to have a religion. But personally, what they care about is, of course, driving a big cars through the streets of Dubai. And they are therefore quite surprised when they hear that this is shirk. So the Arabic, the Mohammedan word for idolatry. Because they have been told in their mosques, of course, oh, you must not commit shirk, it's the worst sin of all. But they think shirk just means praying to a statue, having several gods. So they are confused to hear, and they don't understand that this is shirk, but of course it is. And of course, I'm not the first to say that, but all the great Islamic thinkers, like Rumi, like even Arabi, like Avicenna, they would all agree with me. They would all say, yes, if you put anything besides God, if you say that anything matters, that any physical object is needed for your happiness, when actually all that should be needed is God, then you're committing idolatry. But anyways, back to Kant himself. So it should be clear we should have this attitude of practical idealism, and no one can rationally say anything against this being the proper attitude to live the most happy life. But Kant's philosophy, the whole transcendental project, is about examining the conditions of the possibility of something, right? His critique of pure reason famously asks, what is the condition of the possibility of us even making experience? So here we could also ask, what is the condition that makes such a practical idealism even possible? And to Kant, it lies in the fact that there's not just physical pleasure and pain, but rather there's also happiness on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's unhappiness or sadness or misery. And these to Kant are not the same. You could say that they are feelings of different levels, right? Of different degree. You could say the one, the physical pleasure or pain, is a feeling of first degree, and then the other, the happiness or the misery, is us feeling pleasure at the fact that we are feeling pleasure, or us feeling displeasure at the fact that we are feeling pain. Kant here goes back to the Latin language, which has this distinction of the two words that are quite similar, anima and animus, where you could maybe translate anima with soul. It's the animal soul, so to say. I mean, this is also where the word animal or the word animated comes from, right? That which has an anima, which animates it. So the anima is responsible for our animal life, and therefore it is receptive. It can feel. It can feel pain or pleasure. And the animus you could maybe translate with mind or with spirit. And this is not the receptive animal soul, the feeling soul, but rather this is our reflecting soul. And Kant would say pain or pleasure, that belongs to the anima. But happiness or unhappiness, misery, that belongs to the animus. That is a question of how do we reflect about our physical feelings and about our physical state, and how content or how discontent are we with that state. And as I already said in the previous lecture on Kant Stoicism, to Kant the point is that we don't have to take everything that happens to us and let it affect our mood. And Kant says that these, you could say, second level feelings, this happiness or unhappiness that comes out of reflection, is usually much more strong and has a much bigger effect on us than this, you could say, first level feeling of actual physical pleasure or displeasure. And these physical feelings we cannot always influence. I mean, sure, you also have some influence here. You can eat something tasty that feels good. You can cut yourself with a knife that feels bad. So sure, you can try to seek pleasurable feelings and to avoid painful feelings. But you cannot always do that. Like, you might have some sickness that might make you feel pain, and maybe you have no way of immediately making that pain go away. But this happiness or unhappiness, since it depends on our reflection, this, Kant says, is something that we always have control over. Only he is miserable, not in pain, but actually miserable, who considers himself miserable, Kant says. And he also would say that this person actually deserves being miserable, because considering yourself miserable, whining and complaining about your misfortune, is undignified and goes against the moral duties towards yourself, makes you unworthy of being called a human being. Now, if you think about it, through reflection, you can, on the one hand, make your physical feelings, both the good and the bad ones, become even stronger. So let's start with the bad ones. Someone could be afflicted by some illness that causes him pain and could lie in bed in hospital. Sure, that's not nice. But if now you reflect about your state and also tell yourself, oh, my life sucks so much, how unjust, why has this fate befallen me of all people? Others are out there on a sunny day playing in the park, my friends are playing with each other, and I am here, oh, my life is so terrible. Then you will feel much worse in your state and with your illness than you would otherwise, simply from the level of physical pain you have. But also the good feelings can become stronger. Let's say someone has sex, and let's say he's having sex with a woman that is considered very attractive. Let's say he's having sex with a supermodel. Sure, he may be feeling physical pleasure, he may be feeling an orgasm, and that might be nice. But that physical pleasure as such is probably not greater than if he had sex with a woman that was considered less attractive. Maybe indeed, with the latter, the physical pleasure would even be greater. I mean, maybe this less attractive woman would be better in bed. Or maybe she would actually feel nicer, right? Because maybe it's nicer to have a woman that is a little chubby and you have something that is soft and squishy and that you can grab onto, rather than poking yourself at someone's bones. But he is having sex with the supermodel, and maybe in reflecting about it, he is feeling like finally he can realize his porn fantasies, and he's feeling like he's the greatest alpha chat whatever, and like everyone would envy him, and for that reason he is actually feeling much better than he would with the less attractive woman. And since most people are not very self-reflected, uh, they would probably mix up these different feelings. Like if you ask the guy, he would probably say the sex was better, this woman is better in bed or whatever. When in truth, the sex as such, as the physical act, um, maybe actually isn't better. It just becomes better through the way he thinks about it, through the way he judges it. But not only can we make our physical feelings stronger through the way we reflect about them, we can also make them weaker to the point they are shoved to the background or almost vanish. So that same person that is sick in the hospital with some pain, if he doesn't dwell on the cruel fate that bound him to the hospital bed, but rather just lives his life as good as he can, he will feel much better. I mean, maybe he will read his book or watch a show on TV he likes, or maybe he will chat with a friend who visits him, and or maybe he will get for himself some food that he likes that someone brings him. And if he focuses on these things and doesn't dwell on the pain he's feeling, then the pain will, of course, the physical pain will, of course, not just vanish completely, but it will probably feel much less painful. It will probably be shoved more to the background as a sort of background throbbing, and be a less intense pain. Not because the actual pain is less intense, but because, again, he focuses on it less. And lastly, not only can our reflection make our physical feelings grow stronger or weaker, it can also create feelings of happiness or of misery when physically we are not feeling anything really, right? Like consider a person who lives a normal life, has normal average wealth, so the person's not going hungry or anything. But again, let's say the person feels bad about not being rich, about not being able to buy a big mansion or expensive cars or watches or clothes. Um, and now this person might feel very miserable and like his life is not worth all that much. When actually, he is having no painful feelings at all physically. He's not hungry, he's not sick, he didn't hurt himself, he's perfectly fine. But since he's telling himself that he's lacking so much that he should have or that he needs for happiness, he now probably feels very unhappy. So, in that sense, through the way you reflect about your state, through the way you judge the state you're in life, through the way you judge the things that are happening to you, through the way you either approve and embrace or disapprove and reject your life, you largely have it in your own hand whether you're feeling good about your life or whether you're feeling bad about your life. And all of this is the reason that, according to Kant, the righteous, the morally good person, can, of course, feel pain physically, but can never be truly miserable. Because no matter how terrible your life is, no matter what terrible misfortunes befall you, as long as you're a good person, you at least don't have to reproach and blame yourself. Rather, you can always tell yourself, well, there's nothing I have to regret. There's nothing I have to beat myself up over. And this ability of ours, this ability to reflect on our physical feelings and judge whether we approve or disapprove of them. So the fact that we don't just have an anima but also an animus, this is a large part of what makes us different from animals. The animals, therefore, according to Kant, are incapable of both happiness and misery. They are, of course, not unfeeling, so they are capable of pleasure and pain, but this is just in the moment. They cannot reflect about this. So if you have a dog, let's say, that is currently playing with its owner, and the owner is throwing a stick and the dog is running after it, sure, right now the dog is feeling pleasure. Right now the dog is feeling good. And maybe yesterday the dog also got to play with its owner and had pleasure. And maybe tomorrow the dog will also get to play with its owner and have pleasure. So we, as humans, when we look at this dog now from the outside, we can look at his whole life and judge it and say, this is a happy dog. He is lucky. He is living a good life. But the dog himself, for himself, would not make this judgment. He cannot think of his life as a whole. He would just be in the moment and say, right now I feel good. But he would not say, and yesterday I felt good, and tomorrow I will presumably also feel good, therefore I am happy. I talked about this more extensively in my previous lecture on animal ethics and on what Kant has to say about the animals. But this, again, is a big difference between us and them. Kant says because our misery comes less from our physical feelings of pain and more so from our power of imagination, from us imagining our state to be so terrible. That is why the misfortune that is approaching and that is dreaded is actually worse than the one that befalls us. Kant is convinced that when misfortune hits, human beings, for the most part, can deal with anything. But before that, you will feel like you couldn't deal with it. Like if someone would tell you with absolute certainty that next year you will get in an accident and you will lose both your legs and you will be wheelchair bound all your life, and you knew that this would happen and that this could not be averted, you would probably feel terrible and you would probably feel like your life will end when that happens in a year. But the truth is, of course, that there are people that lost their legs and that live in a wheelchair, and for the most part, they manage. Their life goes on. Or if someone were to tell you with absolute certainty that a dear person of yours was going to die, or that a war was going to break out, you would probably dread this a lot. But then when it actually would happen, it would not be nice, of course. But you would probably find that while you told yourself life would end then and that you could not deal with that, you somehow manage to deal with that. I mean, there are people on this earth that live in terrible conditions, that live with wars and total devastation, and somehow their lives still go on. To me, it reminds me of the novel Fateless, which I would very much recommend, by the Hungarian survivor of the Nazi genocide of the Jews, Imre Kertész, who also got the Nobel Prize for Literature, who died about a decade ago. And this is a semi-autobiographical novel, also about a young Jewish Hungarian boy who survives the concentration camps of Auschwitz and Buchenwald. And in that novel, at the very end, when he comes back home, someone interviews him and someone asks him, how did you manage? Wasn't a concentration camp hell on earth? And he replies, well, if you look back at the whole thing, you look at it, you sort of combine all the experiences and you sum it up into like one thought. Oh, this guy was in the concentration camp. How terrible. But in fact, you do not go through a genocide just like that, but rather you go through it step by step, right? He says one moment they take you. In this moment, you are not in hell, you're not in a genocide. You are being apprehended by the police force. And then you're put on the train. In this moment, you're not in a genocide. You're sitting on the train. You're dealing with that moment of being on the train. And then you're in the camp and waiting there with the other people in a line. But in this moment, you're just standing in a line. And so on and so on. So even in the worst moments, sure, you're close to dying, you're starving, you're doing hard work, but you're not doing it for years. You're doing it for this moment, and then you're doing it in the next moment, and then in the next. And only when you reflect about it, when you anticipate the future, or when afterward you look back, only then will you say, okay, this went on for years. And this attitude that works even in the face of something so terrible as surviving a genocide, this attitude, of course, then is even more true for more trivial things, right? For example, when I look back at my school days, and again, I didn't even have a terrible time at school. For the most part, I enjoyed going to school. But still, looking back nowadays, I wonder how did I manage? How did I survive 12 years of school? 12 years of sitting in class, 12 years of doing largely stupid and useless tasks. And the simple answer, of course, is that I didn't go 12 years to school. I went to school one day at a time, or even one lesson at a time. I wasn't sitting there in 8th grade and saying, oh, and another 4 years ahead, but rather I was sitting there saying, oh, now 2 hours of biology. And then after biology, I said, oh, now an hour of German class or whatever. And likewise, Kant says the misfortune in life is more terrible when it approaches, when we anticipate, when we dread it. Likewise, he says, when we look back, it usually is not so bad anymore. A misfortune that has passed does not bother us anymore. I would, of course, exclude trauma. I would say that's exactly the issue with trauma, right? The traumatized person does not live in the present, where whatever bad thing befell him is over, clearly, and does not directly afflict him anymore, but rather the traumatized person is stuck in the past. But if you exclude traumatized people, then otherwise, what is past is past. So no matter how terrible it was, no matter how painful it was, the pain is now over, and therefore it doesn't matter anymore. Therefore, it is as if that pain had never happened to you. Because after all, in memory, we don't remember the pain. We remember the fact that we were in pain, but not the actual feeling of pain. So if you look back at the moments you were in pain, even if you could change it afterwards, it would not change anything, right? Consider times in your life when you had terrible pain. So, for example, I remember when I was a kid at some point, I visited the zoo with a friend, and there was a playground within the zoo where we were playing, and I was climbing up on some rope, and I slipped, and I was falling down, but I was still clinging to the rope, and so the rope was running along my hands, and my hands got terribly burned. And I remember that they were hurting terribly for, I think, hours. And I could not play anymore with my friend. And I remember doing anything to relieve the pain. I remember we were passing the penguins, and I put my hands into the water of the penguins to cool them a bit. Now, I know that on that day, that was very painful. But nowadays, looking back over, I don't know how old I was, maybe like 10, 12 years, so over 20 years ago, when I look back, I don't care that this happened to me. I would not say, looking back, that my life has been worse because this happened. Of course, in that moment it was, but nowadays, um, if I could erase this from the past, if I could make it so that this never happened, it would not make my life better. I mean, what would that even mean? Make at this point, making it that this never happened. I didn't take any permanent damage on my hands, so the only thing that would really change now, if I could make this unhappen, is that my memory of it would vanish. But this memory doesn't bother me. Since, again, I don't memorize the pain as such, only that I had pain, um, it could as well have happened to my friend instead of me. Then nowadays I would remember that my friend could not play anymore, that he put his hands into the penguin water. Um, it doesn't change a thing. The way I'm remembering and telling the story now, it might as well have happened to another person. So, and this, of course, is not just true for physical pain, but also for psychological pain. Like maybe you were bullied in school at some point. It was not nice in that moment, but looking back nowadays, what does it matter that it happened? Or maybe your parents died at some point and you were sad, but looking back now, does not matter. Again, excluding if you are traumatized, if you are stuck in the past. But otherwise, pain past is pain that might as well have never happened, is pain that doesn't matter. Kant even goes so far as to say that sometimes past pain that we remember can make the present pleasure sweeter, right? Because we are relieved to have passed the pain. So he says that someone who walked through a cold night for a long time and now finally reaches a warm hut might actually feel more comfort inside that hut than the person who spent all night in that hut in the warmth. Um, because he now is looking back at the cold, and now he is not cold anymore, so the cold doesn't bother him anymore. But the memory of having been cold and comparing that with his new state, with the warmth, actually causes him bigger happiness. So, in conclusion, Kant does not take the human being to be a victim of the world, but to be a perpetrator. He says, if you are sad, then the whole world seems sad to you and gives you more reason for sadness. On the other hand, the joyful person, wherever he looks, the world laughs at him and gives him new reason to be cheered up. And therefore, what matters is simply from what side you look at the world. What matters is how you approach the world, how you deal with the things that are happening to you. And this depends on what kind of person you are, both by nature and by character. You can go back to my 2 lectures on the good heart and the good character, where I explained that to Kant, what we call a person's character or personality nowadays is actually separated into 2 parts. There is the mode of sense, that is what nature makes of us. So let's say my character by my natural disposition, that is my temperament. And then there's the mode of thinking, which is what Kant actually calls the character. That is what I make out of myself. My character that I create through the principles I set for myself. And both can influence how I deal with the world. So by nature, by disposition, I can have a more melancholic temperament or a more sanguine temperament. And Kant says that the difference between these two is not in how they receive what the world gives them. It's not how they feel. It's not in their sensitivity, but rather it is in how they deal with it, what they make out of it. But of course, you don't have to simply accept what nature made you. Even if by nature you are prone to melancholy, through your own thinking, through your own reflection, you can still create for yourself a different character. You can still get into this attitude of practical idealism and take the world to be a game, to be something ridiculous, instead of something so serious. Kant says that the wise person, and therefore the philosopher in the world sense, has a constantly or permanently cheerful heart. However, when Kant says cheerful here, he does not mean being super excited or laughing loudly the whole time. He's not talking about extreme joy. No, this cheerfulness is a more quiet thing. What Kant means, how he describes it, is precisely the ability to consider all things that happen to you in life from a pleasant perspective. And of course, this attitude, this posture, is something that different philosophers have talked about. My dad would say it is about finding the divine in everything in life, even in the seemingly bad things. Nietzsche talks about it when he describes the well-turned-out man, about whom he says, "Now, by what signs are nature's lucky strokes recognized among men? They are recognized by the fact that any such lucky stroke gladdens our senses, that he is carved from one integral block, which is hard, sweet, and fragrant as well. He enjoys that only which is good for him. His pleasure, his desire ceases when the limits of that which is good for him are overstepped. He divines remedies for injuries. He knows how to turn serious accidents to his own advantage. That which does not kill him makes him stronger. He instinctively gathers his material from all he sees, hears, and experiences. He is a selective principle. He rejects much. He is always in his own company, whether his intercourse be with books, with man, or with natural scenery. He honors the things he chooses, the things he acknowledges, the things he trusts. He reacts slowly to all kinds of stimuli, with that tardiness which long caution and deliberate pride have bred in him. He tests the approaching stimulus. He would not dream of meeting it halfway. He believes neither in ill luck nor guilt. He can digest himself and others. He knows how to forget. He is strong enough to make everything turn to his own advantage. I myself would say it is about approaching life not as a victim, but as a perpetrator. So, in a way, having the attitude of a little child, which, sure, when the sun shines, will happily go outside and play. But when it rains, the little child has not learned yet that this is a bad thing. The little child will be just as happy to go outside and to jump into the puddles. And this attitude, that is the constantly cheerful heart that Kant talks about, that we can reach through this practical idealism of his. But of course, again, we can only reach this if we are virtuous, if we are righteous people, because only these don't depend on the world and on the things in the world. Only these righteous people have the necessary independence. And Kant says he who has learned to be content with any state can, even if something bad, if some misfortune befalls him, still make a joke about it. And so, since it is all about how we look at life, what our outlook, what our perspective is, Kant recommends looking at everything from a healthy or from a soul healing perspective. And if you ask which perspective that is, Kant would answer it's the correct perspective. So he is convinced that the way to look at life that is most healthy for your soul is to look at life as it really is. He is convinced that you don't need illusions to feel good. Rather, the illusions make you feel bad. I mean, just consider looking at other people. The person who is a slave to his passions, and I gave a whole lecture on affections and passions and what they are and why we should get rid of them, according to Kant. The person who is, for example, infatuated with someone else. I'm not talking about actual love. Actual love, according to Kant, can be seeing. Actual love does not blind you, but infatuation does. If you are infatuated with someone, you're not looking at that person as he truly is. You are putting that person on a pedestal. You are telling yourself this person is perfect, and life without this person is meaningless, and out of 8 billion people, this is the only person in the world who could possibly make you happy. This is, of course, a recipe for being unhappy if things don't work out. Or likewise, for a negative example, take resentment. If you hate a person, if you deeply resent a person, if you are bitter towards a person, you're also not looking at the person as they truly are. I mean, maybe the person does have bad qualities. Maybe the person is kind of an asshole. But the person is probably not as bad, as terrible, as one-dimensional, as irredeemable as you make that person out to be in your mind. So if you were looking at him more as he is, with his bad qualities, but maybe also with some redeeming qualities, maybe you would not become his best friend, but you would not have this burning hatred eating away at your heart. So again, all the wrong perspectives are perspectives unhealthy for your soul. We should get rid of illusions. We should look at life as it truly is. That is also the perspective that is most healthy for us, Kant would say. Because what is life truly like? Again, pretty unimportant. Fleeting, short, not very valuable, apart from what truly matters from the moral law. And so we kind of circled back to the beginning. Again, this is the very attitude we should take up. Kant says that when there are moral evils in the world, we should, of course, resist them. We should fight them. When we witness injustice, we should fight against that. But when there are physical evils, like, for example, us getting sick or losing some money or whatever, sure, if we can help it, we can do something about it. We don't have to just accept it. Like, when we are sick, we can go to the physician, we can take medicine. But when there are physical evils that cannot be helped, that cannot be resisted, then we should sort of resign ourselves to them and just remind ourselves that they aren't what matters. And that no matter how painful they are, they will be over. At worst, they will be over when we die, which, all things considered, will be soon enough. So that is the attitude towards life that makes us most happy, or at least that prevents most unhappiness, because clearly it's less of a positive way of attaining happiness and more of a negative way of preventing misery. And here I come to my last point. Kant says one of the greatest tools that helps us in achieving this constantly cheerful heart and thereby living a happy life is our ability of abstraction. Because Kant says we can control our abstraction and our attention. Both of them, by the way, belong together to Kant. They are essentially just two sides of the same coin, and you cannot do one without the other. I mean, consider being in a place where lots of people are talking, like, for example, in a restaurant. And now let's say you want to listen to specifically one person. Maybe you're having a conversation with the person on your table, or maybe you want to eavesdrop on the neighboring table or whatever. You will now pay attention to what that one person says, but paying attention to him means abstracting from what all the other people are saying. You still hear them, but it just becomes unintelligible background noise. It just becomes blabbering while your attention is on that one person. But you could just as well describe it the other way around. Instead of saying, I pay attention to him and thereby abstract from all the others, you could also say, I abstract from all the others and thereby pay attention to him. Either way, we should control this ability of abstraction and attention of ours. Here, once more, you see how prudence, so the way towards a happy life, and morality, a dignified life, align. Because, as I explained in my lecture on the duties towards ourselves, these duties really revolve around freedom. They are about our dignity as human beings, as rational beings, and this dignity lies in our freedom. So the duties towards myself are essentially all about retaining my freedom. So that's why I mustn't commit suicide, or why I shouldn't get drunk or addicted or whatever. And if I can, I should expand my freedom, which is precisely why I should educate myself, cultivate myself, learn new abilities, hone my talents, because it expands my freedom. And this expanding our freedom, in this Kant explicitly includes that we should master our own mental faculties. We should learn to control them, to control our power of imagination, for example, so it doesn't run wild with uninvited fantasies and daydreams, but rather so that we can use it as a tool however we want. And likewise, he would say, it is included amongst these moral duties towards myself that I should gain control of my ability of abstracting and of paying attention. And now here we see how this action that we should do anyways, because it's a moral duty, can lead to happiness. Because Kant says unhappiness in life largely comes from the fact that people don't abstract enough from their pain, from their suffering. Just consider my lecture on the affections and the passions, where I said just that the problem is that a person is overwhelmed by one feeling or by one desire that makes that person forget all the others, and that makes that person act in an irrational manner, because that person cannot abstract enough from this one emotion or this one desire, right? In that lecture, I said that Kant gives the example of a rich man whose servant accidentally breaks some cup of his, some expensive cup, and then the rich man gets angry. That is just because he doesn't abstract enough from this specific situation, from this one broken cup, and fails to consider all his wealth, which isn't really threatened by one broken cup. So Kant says your ability of abstraction is one of your most important, your most helpful tools, because even physical pain, again, maybe you hurt yourself, maybe you had an accident, or maybe you are sick and you're in pain, even that pain can maybe not go away fully, but can be shoved largely to the background in many cases, if you just abstract from it and just focus on something else. Like, you don't have to lie there and focus on the pain and say, oh, I'm so much in pain, I feel so terrible. You can just focus on something else, like, let's say, reading your book, and then the pain will not annoy you so much. It reminds me of a story that my dad would always like to tell, of me when I was very small. Like, I myself don't remember it. I was maybe 1 or 2 or 3, I don't know. But I was pretty sick, with a very blocked nose, coughing lots, and some acquaintance was visiting, and she asked my dad, "Oh, the poor boy, don't we want to do something for him? Don't you want to put him in bed?" And Dad said, "No, look at him. He is playing with his trains. He's happy." So she focused on my sickness because I was coughing so much, but I myself did not focus on it. My attention was on my toys, on my trains that I was playing with, and thereby, because again, these two always come together, by putting my attention to something else, I automatically abstracted from my blocked nose or from my coughing, hurting throat or whatever. So in essence, of course, I had not studied Kant back then, but I already showed the disposition towards a philosophical attitude towards life. I already practiced, to a degree, this constantly cheerful heart, and this is exactly why I could later become a philosopher. If you don't have this attitude first, you can read and study as much as you want. I promise you won't become a philosopher. You won't truly understand it. You can maybe become a scholar, but that is something very different from a philosopher. You first need to attain this constantly cheerful heart. And I can think of more serious stories than this one from my childhood that I think nicely illustrate what Kant is talking about. So, for one, there was a patient that my dad would treat for, I think, over a decade, as a physiotherapist. This guy had paraplegia since he had been 17. He had been taking flying lessons, and then there had been a crash, and now he was completely paralyzed since then. And most people would probably think in his stead, oh, that's terrible, and my life is over. In fact, that's exactly what he told my dad when he was in the hospital at first, and there were others with similar conditions. Everyone else besides him was just whining about how his life was over. And in the case of this guy, this patient of my dad's, not only could he have felt sorry for himself for the rest of his life, he also could have been angry and resentful with his father for the rest of his life, because actually, as it happened, he himself had wanted to end these flying lessons anyways. And only because his dad pressured him to keep going with them did he get into that crash that paralyzed him. But he neither felt sorry for himself, nor did he felt angry at his dad. He simply went on with life as best as he could in his state. And he managed to have a life that actually lots of people would envy him for. He graduated with very good grades. He became a successful businessman, earning quite a bit more than the average person. And he was very successful with women. He liked meeting women at parties, having one night stands. He was at the sort of dolled up Barbie type, and he was successful with them. Now, lots of people would have simply told themselves, no, my life is over. What woman would want me when I'm paralyzed? And then, of course, that becomes a self fulfilling prophecy, right? I mean, look at all the incels who tell themselves, oh, no woman wants me because I don't know, I'm too short or I'm balding or whatever. If you just keep telling yourself that, then surely it will become true. You will not have any success. This guy, however, was successful. Now, being a successful businessman, hooking up with these kinds of women is not for everyone. It's not the kind of lifestyle I would want. But that's besides the point. My point is that he lived his life how he wanted. He did not feel being paralyzed would hold him back forever. So he abstracted from this state of his and made the best out of it. Let me give a second, even more extreme example, and that is of Jack Terry, who had been a Jewish boy from Poland. Originally, Jakob Schabmacher was his name, who lost his whole family in the genocide of the European Jews. He had to witness his own mother and sister being shot. Likewise, his brother was killed, his father was killed. He himself, when he was 13, got into a concentration camp where he survived for 2 years before it was liberated. And he then got to live in the US, got to be adopted there. And with this biography, no one would, of course, be surprised if he had been a deeply traumatized, deeply depressed person. But he was quite successful. He came to America not speaking a word of English, and within half a year, he was tutoring his classmates who were native English speakers. He graduated successfully. Later, he actually went on to become a therapist, and amongst his patients were quite a few survivors of the genocide, as well as children of survivors whom he would help. He had a loving family, and I myself had the great fortune and the great honor to meet him. By now he has passed away, but some years ago, when he was still alive, he came for some event to Berlin and spoke at the American embassy. And I and some friends, we went there, we listened to him speaking, and then afterward, you could talk to him, you could ask questions. And what struck me was the types of questions that were asked, because you could tell that many of the people asking questions, they had this victim posture in life. They approached life as victims and assumed everyone else would also. So their questions were focused on, oh, how terrible was it? How could you ever deal with that? How could you ever move on about losing your family like that? Did you ever want revenge? How can you be in Germany now? Talk to Germans. Don't you hate us all? And Terry, he would not avoid these questions when they were asked. He would answer them, but he would not dwell on them for long. His answers were rather brief, because you could just tell this was not his outlook on life. His outlook was not, oh, but terrible things happened to me, or oh, these evil people who have wronged me so much. If you focus on that, of course you're gonna be unhappy. But he abstracted from that. And instead, I was struck by what he focused on. Again, he didn't avoid the questions, he answered them when they were asked, but by himself, he did not talk extensively about all the bad things. He talked very extensively about the good things. And there were good things. He talked very long about what it had felt like after 2 years in a concentration camp, to, for the first time again, be able to use a toothbrush. What pleasure that had been. Which, again, also goes back to the point of Kant, right? That suffering makes the pleasure that comes after even greater, because looking back at our suffering that is now over, we appreciate what we have now even more. Or what I remember the most, he talked about right after American soldiers had liberated the concentration camp, he and fellow inmates were starving, and there was a horse there. And they asked an American soldier to shoot the horse so they could eat it. And he said the soldier did it for them, but reluctantly and looking away. He could not look at the horse while he shot it. And Terry told us how that really impressed him as a 15-year-old boy who had just survived the Holocaust, because so far he had experienced human beings, and particularly those in uniform, to just be monsters, cold-hearted monsters that would even shoot other human beings without hesitation. And here was this man in uniform who hesitated to even shoot an animal. That was the moment Terry explained to us, when he regained his faith in humanity, and when he also started to trust the American soldiers. So my point is this: you could easily imagine a person with the exact same biography as Jack Terry, who would be completely miserable and traumatized for the rest of his life. And surely there have been such person. I mean, clearly not with the exact same biography, but with a very similar one. I mean, maybe there is a Holocaust survivor that got depressed, that maybe even committed suicide later, who also experienced an American soldier hesitating to shoot a horse. But maybe this other Holocaust survivor did not focus on that. Maybe for him that was a small episode that he barely remembers, and maybe he is just focused on how he witnessed a German soldier shooting his mother and sister in front of his eyes, which also happened to Terry. But Terry did not dwell on that the most, but rather he focused on the episode with the horse. So, and he abstracted more from the bad experiences. So my point is that in any biography, you will have good and bad moments. There's no human life that is solely bad or solely good. Of course, some have much more extreme bad experiences, like going through a genocide, losing your family. Um, Others maybe have lots of good, of happy experiences. But even in the best life, there were surely some bad moments, and even in the worst life, there were surely some good moments, even if it was just getting a toothbrush back after 2 years. And so the question is, what do you focus on? And what do you abstract from? And that is why it is so important to have your ability to abstract and to pay attention and to master it. And with that, I'm concluding this lecture on the practical idealism and the constantly cheerful heart and how to attain it. As I already said, we can see here that Kant's whole teaching, his whole doctrine of happiness, is more of a negative one. He's not saying we need to attain X, Y, Z to be happy, but rather he's mostly saying we need to avoid X, Y, Z. We need to become independent. We need to not take life so seriously. The issue is precisely people taking it too seriously and thinking that they need something to be happy. And that if they don't have it, if they lack some luxury or whatever, some pleasures in life, they must be unhappy. And the way to become happy is precisely to not need anything apart from your own peace of mind, your own good conscience, your own morality, your own virtue, but rather to take life more easily, to take it more as something short, something fleeting, some big joke. With that said, however, there is also a positive doctrine of happiness to be found in Kant's writings. He does say there's also something that we mustn't avoid, but rather that we can do to attain happiness. And that is precisely doing, acting. He's saying we become happy not so much through indulging in pleasures, but rather through being active. And this is one more topic I want to address briefly in my next lecture, before then closing off these few lectures I gave here on the topic of happiness. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenkubilay Altu, Thomas Deuringer, Kim Giamatti, Ellen Hansen, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.